Yeah, then I talk at greater length, then you come back.
Then I come back.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
And we open up in the second half of the
And then we
call.
open it up.
In the second half. Okay.
All right, let us jump right in. Again, we really apologize. Our dear brother Bernie Sanders couldn't make it. He had a zillion things going on. He had planned to be here, but that's all right. We shall continue. We have been accenting very much the historical and the programmatic dimensions of the overall argument that we've been trying to put forward. The argument which has its own variations and versions, but still profound and deep overlap. But we want to accent today American exceptionalism, which is to say, let's try to get at the spirit, the geist of American culture and civilization. Let's accent the ways in which, when you really talk about the American experiment and all of its various iterations and elaborations, to keep track of the cultural and spiritual dimensions of it. And this issue of not just what separates America from other national experiments, but the long history of the ideologies of American exceptionalism. And before I say a few words about that, before I open it up to my dear brother Roberto, he's going to elaborate, then I'll respond in a sustained way. He and I will go at it for about an hour. Then we're going to open it up and we'll all be in it together for about an hour. But we can't proceed for me without acknowledging what happened 51 years ago with the murder of my dear brother, Martin Luther King Jr. The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel is one of the great prophetic figures of the barbaric 20th century. He used to say over and over again, the very future of America depends on the impact and influence of the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., not because he was a particular individual, but because he represented and exemplified so much of the best of the geist, the spirit of American civilization. One could go as far as to say human civilization. What does it mean to really look chronic systemic hatred in the face and still muster the courage to love neighbor, to love truth, goodness, beauty, to love democracy, to love justice, as it were. So as we reflect on what we see in Alexis de Tocqueville in 1835 and 1840 classics, when he says America's exceptional in the sense that it has puritanical origins, it's obsessed with commercial things, and it focuses on practical objects, and therefore seems to swerve from the dominant orientation of the national experiments of Europe. And keep in mind, de Tocqueville, of course, has a very narrow cast. He's thinking primarily of France and England and Germany and the ways in which America is very different from those national experiments, from those social experiments. And of course, he goes on with the claim about equality that we can contest. But de Tocqueville initiates this dialogue about what it is about the United States that makes it so distinctive and unique and singular. Now, as you can imagine, the best of that interpretation would say, of course, every nation state is different from other nation states. And of course, every nation state has its own myth of origins, which is to say, it tells lies about itself in order to make itself feel good. Every empire has a ferocious appetite of self-congratulation. And the wordsmiths who rationalize those empires are highly rewarded. But the issue is, how do you get at the veritas? How do you get at the truth of the geist, the truth of the spirit, the culture of America in all of its heterogeneity, variety, diversity, and complexity? So there's no one core, there's no one essence, but there's a number of things that we could reflect on that would lead us to say, yes, there is something distinctive. Something distinctive that we have in mind when we talk about being America, when you're talking about the American experiment. You see. And that's exactly what we want to examine on the ideological front, on the political front, on the economic front, on the intellectual front. I'm just going to say a brief word about the last one and then have much more to say in response to Brother Roberto on the first three. One of the difficulties of trying to make sense of America is that intellectually it has a profound suspicion of intellect. Just as one could say, one of the things that makes America exceptional is that it is so obsessed with its own exceptionality. Other nations may not be as so obsessed with it. City on the hill, beacon of liberty, manifest destiny, indispensable nation, all of these iterations of the exceptionality. And you say to yourself, why are these Americans so insecure about themselves that they've got to ensure that they preserve their exceptionality, usually associated with their superiority? So when people say, I am an American, that's a little different than saying, I am a Lithuanian. Lithuania would say, oh, yes, it's a nice thing being Lithuanian. We appreciate that. We've got histories of invasion and subordination and occupation, but we have a sense of who we are, but we're not obsessed with it. But when we say we are Americans, we want the whole world to know. Just huge global microphone. Yes, we're Americans. Do you hear that in Russia, Samoa, Australia, New Zealand, Japan? Where's the sources? What are the sources of that kind of anxiety? We already see it in the classical work of Alexis de Tocqueville. What is it about these people that makes them so obsessed with wealth, commodities, prosperity, and yet at the same time still so anxiety-ridden about who they are in regard to their national identity? And of course, part of this has to do with the fact that America's in denial, just like 51 years ago. A vicious legacy of white supremacy is operating. But Martin was killed in part because of what? His critique of empire, his critique of capitalism, and his critique of white supremacy. All simultaneously put together, constituting such a major threat. So you begin with a denial of empire. We are, Thomas Jefferson says, an empire of liberty. Now let's unpack that. Let's demystify that. How can you be an empire of liberty? What does that look like from the vantage point of indigenous peoples? What does that look like from the vantage point of Mexicans who are under Spanish imperial rule and you're on the way for their land? What does that look like from the vantage point of enslaved Africans? What does that look like from the vantage point of these white male and female immigrants from the impoverished sections of Europe that are trying to gain access to some prosperity, but still have a hybridity in the sense of who they are because they still have memories of Ireland and the British imperial subordination of Ireland, of southern Italy, and the subordination of southern Italy by northern Italians, and on and on and on, of Jews and Jew-hating sections of Eastern Europe and Russia, just trying to get some distance from the vicious persecution and so on. This is just a brief skeletal framework of a serious discussion about these claims about city on the hill, beacon of liberty, you see. And we come all the way through 19th century, 20th century, 21st century, and the obsession remains. One of the classics ever written on American culture by Richard Hofstadter, called Anti-Intellectualism in America. And he draws a distinction between intellect and intelligence. He says Americans are preoccupied with intelligence, but fearful of intellect. Intelligence is a manipulative faculty. It has to do with trying to achieve very practical ends and aims. Intellect, it's reflective. It's not manipulative. It's not just about evaluations. It evaluates the evaluations. It's not just about jumping into a framework. It examines the assumptions and presuppositions of the framework. that makes America United States, a profoundly anti-intellectual civilization, because it fears deep Socratic interrogation about itself. It wants you to jump into the fray, jump into the framework, now negotiate and navigate, rather than sit back and say, what are the conditions under which this project emerged in the first place? Who suffered and who didn't suffer? What are the dynamics of power going on here? What are the dominant structures of feeling and value that have been hegemonic? Why did we have a civil war? Why, after when Martin Luther King got shot, over 175 cities were burning? You had to bring in the National Guard for the first time since the Civil War to protect the White House because some very angry black folk were going to de-whitenize the White House because you killed the one who loved us so, or in such a way that he was willing to give his life for us. And even Wilmington, Delaware, for 6 months you had to have tanks in order to contain the rage. And Wilmington, Delaware is not known to being on the cutting edge of black rage. I mean, we love brothers and sisters in Wilmington, but hey, this is not Detroit. This is not the south side of Chicago. This is not South Central Los Angeles. This is not Black Bottoms, it's Cleveland. This is Wilmington, Delaware. That's how deep it cut. And so as we reflect on American exceptionalism, reflect on the various ways in which American soulcraft have been articulated over time, and we reflect on our own lives, those of us who have been shaped, immersed in America, and the ways in which our identities have been influenced by things American, that we involve ourselves in a Socratic self-examination as well as an interrogation of this object of American exceptionalism. So let me stop there and hand it over to my dear brother Roberto. He's going to reflect, I will respond, and then we'll open it up for our
Very good.
Our fray.
So in the course up to now, we have chiefly alternated between a historical and a programmatic focus. But something is missing, or something has remained understated, which is the protagonist itself of the historical inquiry or of the programmatic alternatives. The protagonist is the United States. It's the prince, the missing prince in our dialogue. And this conversation today is an attempt then to deal with this prince, to evoke the deepest and most distinctive elements of the American experience. And we do so under the famous label of American exceptionalism, which we can interpret in two main ways: in a form that is narrow and dogmatic, or in another form that is loose, empirical, and tentative. The narrow dogmatic form has two characteristics. One is it distinguishes the United States from all the other countries in the world. All the others are on another side, and the United States is alone. And the second characteristic is that it wants to attribute to the United States, and only to the United States, an exemplary significance. That it's the American experience which should be the light to guide humanity. But there is another deflationary conception of American exceptionalism, which is the one on which we are proceeding here. All the nations in the world are in some place on this route from having been real or imagined tribes to being experiments in humanity, into different ways of being human. And they are distinctive. And the distinctions of consciousness are linked to distinctions of institutions. That's the sense of experimentalism that we are invoking here in our conversation. There nevertheless remains to my mind, an element of truth in that other conception of experimentalism. And I'll say what it is. That in these comparisons that we make between the United States and other contemporary nations and nation states, it will turn out repeatedly that all of the characteristics are on a spectrum, on a continuum, but very frequently the United States is on an extreme point of this spectrum in each of the dimensions that we will discuss. So in that sense, the United States is an outlier. And this circumstance of being an outlier, which I hope the subsequent discussion will illustrate, creates a complication. The United States has been the dominant power in the world in the recent historical period. And American power has been intimately associated with the main direction of the world order, globalization. And so globalization has to some extent presented itself to humanity with the American face. And this has elicited a confusion in the world because the reaction to globalization or to this dominant form of the world order has been a reaction to Americanization. And that's why this discussion has such tangible political significance. And why it's so important to understand what, in fact, is characteristic of the United States, and in what respects it has been an outlier. I intend to divide these remarks into three main domains: social structure, institutions, and consciousness. But before doing that, I want to begin with a very rudimentary comparison of the United States to the other country that I know best, Brazil. Brazil is in many respects the country in the world that is most like the United States. And so the comparison has special interest. These are two countries of almost identical size, one in the north and the other in the south, founded on the same basis of European settlement and African slavery. Each of these two countries is the most unequal by far of its respective type. The United States of the rich industrial democracies, and Brazil of the major developing countries. Each of them is a very religious society. And religion continues to be, in each of them, a central part of the national experience. And in each of them, paradoxically, in the midst of these tremendous inequalities and exclusions that beset them, the majority of ordinary men and women continue to believe at some level that everything is possible and have the religion of the new, seemingly not completely defeated or suppressed by the reality of subjugation and exclusion. So these are striking similarities. But of course, in many other dimensions of their national experience, there are equally stark contrasts. And I will now just mention two of them. One having to do with institutions, and the other with consciousness and with the experience of social life. So the Americans, I argued before earlier in our course, have always been tempted to believe that their country discovered at the time of its foundation as an independent republic the definitive formula of a free society. And the rest of humanity, according to this belief, must either subscribe to this formula or continue to languish in poverty and despotism. So the extreme form of this belief has been the cult of the Constitution. But there's a similar, less precise belief with respect to the economic arrangements of the market order. And I've argued throughout the semester that this sacrifice of American experimentalism to American exceptionalism in the domain of institutions is a vast burden imposed on American democracy. So there's a vast experimentalist impulse in American culture, but the Americans make an exception to the institutions and exempt the institutions from the reach of the experimentalist impulse. They would be better advised to lift this exemption, as many of their greatest political thinkers, from Thomas Jefferson to John Dewey, advised them to do. Now, Brazil is in a sense the opposite, because in Brazil, although the popular culture has great originality and vitality, the elites have been unable or unwilling to develop institutions. So all of our institutions are borrowed or copied, many of them from the United States. They're like borrowed clothes, and they don't fit us. It has been the reverse assumption. The Americans think if there's a good institution, we invented it. It's here, like the Constitution. And the Brazilians have been the opposite. These are two political and spiritual perversions that are equally serious. Now, the second contrast is this. The characteristic formula of social life in traditional Brazilian society, as in many societies of the past, has been a combination in the same recurrent social relations of exchange, power, and reciprocal allegiance or loyalty or sentiment. So the characteristic social relation could be described as a sentimentalization of unequal exchange. That's what many societies have been like in the historical past, like feudalism, or there's an exchange between the superior and the inferior, an exchange of material and moral benefits. The exchange takes place in a context of inequality, of power, of domination, but there's an overlay of allegiance or sentiment. And this formula has never been acceptable in most parts of American life. So what has prevailed has been the characteristically liberal idea that the elements of power, exchange, and allegiance, emotion, sentiment should be dissociated and allocated to different domains of social life. Exchange to the market, power to politics, allegiance or sentiment to the family and to domestic life. And this has been the dominant formula in the world. It has become a doctrine. So emancipation throughout the world, as in the United States, is associated with this disassociation of the elements. And we now have it in Brazil as well, because we have 40 or 50 million evangelical Protestants. And among many other things, evangelical Protestantism in Brazil in its political theology is a kind of liberalism for the masses. So what it proposes is a secession from this tainted society into these micro worlds characterized by liberal relations of autonomy, reliability, and promise-keeping. But there's a problem, and it's a problem faced by both of these countries and by societies around the world. That the earlier experience, that sentimentalization of unequal exchange, was associated with charm, with warmth. And the disassociation is a kind of cooling or coldness. So, for example, Talleyrand said in France, those who did not live before the revolution do not know the sweetness of life. And he wasn't referring just to the benefits that the aristocrats had. He was referring to this incandescent, this warm character of social life. So it seems that humanity has not discovered how it can be both free and warm, and how it can be emancipated from that formula of the traditional society without this retreat into the distance from one another. Now, we were talking about this before the class, and I was remarking that it seemed to me that in segments of American life, as in the life of American blacks and their communities, this dilemma had somehow been avoided. And that through some combination of the life of individual, of family, of community, and of church, parts of the American population had discovered a way not to retreat into the coldness of the middle distance. Well, let me leave that comment there, and we'll come back to it, I hope, subsequently in the conversation. So then, these three areas for inquiry into the American distinctions. First is social structure. Like all contemporary societies, the United States is a class society. And what is remarkable is that it combines a particularly rigid and pronounced form of the class hierarchy with great restraints on social mobility, with a tendency to deny the reality of class. So it's even more of a class society than, for example, the European social democracies. But it's much less willing than they are to recognize that it is a class society. And not only is there a class structure, but it's a class structure that has a very conventional form, the same basic form that is repeated in many of these other societies. On top, there's a professional and business class, has an upper plutocratic fringe. Then there's a small business class. Then there's a working class with a blue-collar and a white-collar segment. And then there's an underclass in the unstable part of the labor market, much of it racially stigmatized in some way. That's the class structure. Now, the majority of the Americans claim that they are something called middle class, which seems to refer to a combination of the small business class with the working class. But the significance of this allusion to the concept of middle class is to represent in some ways an aspect, an expression, of this denial of the class structure, which has the particular form it has. There have really been only two massive episodes of social mobility in American history. Through one of them, the children of farmers and farmhands became industrial workers, and through the other, the children of industrial workers became white-collar workers. The denial of class seems to be related to another paradox, which is, on the one hand, it of course, almost by definition, makes it harder to confront and overcome the realities of class. But on the other hand, it seems to facilitate cooperation across class lines, because the class lines are treated as if they were non-existent or invisible. Now, a second feature of the American social structure is the complication introduced by race. And by race in a context in which there has been very limited racial miscegenation, unlike Brazil, where outside the far south of the country, the whole population is some kind of racial mixture. So in that other country, there's also racial discrimination and racial injustice, but it takes different forms from the form that it takes in the United States. The approach to racial injustice that has prevailed in the United States and that is now consummated in the integrationist orthodoxy, represented by policies like affirmative action, treats the racial injustice as a prior threshold issue separate from class injustice, and tends in some way to deepen or aggravate this division between race and class, rather than to see them together in some way as composing a reality of social hierarchy. Now, another feature of the American social structure is the great significance of the regional divisions in the country. And you can think of them, first of all, in what has been their most inspiring form, which is in great states like California or Texas, and on the agrarian frontier in general. It's as if the Central American message were heightened and given a particular form. And it's as if in each of these regions, the country had a second chance to reinterpret itself, to reshape itself. So there's this utopian element in the regional culture. Of course, there's another element, as we discussed in the South, with its experience of constraint and defeat and tragedy, which is, as it were, a shadow. And there's been this internal conversation among these regional cultures in the evolution of American civilization. The diminishment of these regional differences is a great problem for the United States, because it denies the country one of these elements of inspiration and complexity that can serve it as incitements to reshape itself. Now, here's a fourth characteristic of the American structure, understood in its historical dimension. So I mentioned that when Tocqueville came in the first half of the 19th century, the vast majority of men were either slaves or self-employed. So free white men, 4 out of 5 of them, worked for themselves rather than working for another man. And that was this experience of having their own base, their own world. So the economic basis of this ideal of self-construction. And this fact seems to have placed on American civilization a lasting imprint. That this is what social experience should be like on the American belief. But now we know that half of the American population today would be unable to put $400 together in an emergency. So this is the opposite of this experience. And it's an experience of extreme vulnerability and humiliation, made all the more painful by the authority of this idea that social life should have that other form. Now, there's another implication of this in the American social structure, which is the great significance of one of the classes, the small business class. Now, the small business class has millions of members in the United States. And despite calling them a small business class, some of those members can even have several $1 million today. But this class, in this historical context that I've described, punches above its weight in the American spirit. That is, to some extent, it helps give the tone to the whole country, because it speaks in the name of this historical experience and this great ideal, which it has been unable to reinvent. So that the idea of modest economic prosperity and independence could take forms different from the form of traditional, isolated, archaic family business, based as family business is generally throughout the world on family savings and self-exploitation, and without a horizon to radical organizational and technological innovation. Now we come to the second domain. This is all social structure. So the second domain is institutions. The political institutions, the economic institutions, and the organization of American federalism. So first, the political institutions. Again, this is not uniquely American, but it's an extreme on a worldwide spectrum. All the democracies that exist in the world are what you could call weak democracies. All of them maintain the people at a relatively low level of popular engagement in political life. All of them tend to perpetuate impasse. All of them continue to depend on crisis as the condition of change. And all of them, therefore, perpetuate the rule of the living by the dead. But the United States, in its constitutional arrangements, is explicitly a proto-democratic liberalism. It's not just that there are many counter-majoritarian or, frankly, anti-democratic elements in the American constitutional arrangements. It's that the whole constitutional design is intended deliberately to associate a liberal principle of the fragmentation of power with a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. It's not just the separation of powers. It's the existence of a series of constitutional obstacles to the transformative use of politics. And it's not necessary. The Americans often think it's necessary, that these two principles are inseparable, but they're not inseparable. And you could easily imagine a series of constitutional mechanisms that, in the presence of impasse between the political branches of government, would resolve the impasse quickly to accelerate politics. But the American constitutional arrangements are designed to prevent the acceleration of politics, to inhibit political transformation, to establish a kind of table of correspondences between the transformative reach of a political project and the severity of the constitutional obstacles that it has to overcome. And what this is in modern political history is a form of what used to be called the mixed constitution. So in Montesquieu's typology of the regimes, it most closely resembles the regime that he calls the aristocratic regime, the monarchy. And in which there are a range of intermediate and fragmented powers restraining each other and allowing the background social and economic order to remain relatively untouched, except in a circumstance of crisis. Now, a second aspect of the institutional arrangements and the institutional ideas has to do with the economic order. So the dominant belief is a market economy has a single natural and necessary form. A society can be or not be a market order, but if it is a market order, the institutional and legal content of the market order is predetermined, with a very small range of possible variation. And this belief is false. A market order has no natural and necessary form. That's the main analytical achievement of legal thought over the last 150 years to have established that. Up to the 1930s and the great conflict over the New Deal in the United States, the dominant legal ideas viewed private law, the law of contract and property, as being distributively neutral, as an impersonal law of coordination among free economic agents. So good law was the law that was distributively neutral. Bad law would be politicized law, in which someone would take over the power of the state and use it to redistribute resources to himself. And then this idea was constitutionally entrenched. That's what in American constitutional history was called Lochnerism. And there was a conflict in the New Deal, because under this view, minimum wage legislation or the progressive income tax would all be regarded as illegitimate attempts to redistribute and unconstitutional. So this was overturned, but it was never overturned completely. And a large part of the background belief in the naturalness of the market order survives in the United States. Let me give you an example. It's a somewhat technical legal example, but it's very revealing. In American public law and constitutional law, there's something called the state action doctrine. And it distinguishes those realities in the creation of which the government is complicit, that is, they're politically created, from the other arrangements that are somehow pre-political. But which are the arrangements that are pre-political? Because that idea of the state action doctrine requires us to believe that part of the legal and social arrangements are somehow natural and pre-political, but there aren't any such arrangements. So that's an example of the vestigial but significant survival in the American consciousness and in American legal and institutional practice of this idea of the natural order. Now, federalism. So you know that in the Federalist Papers and in the founding documents of the United States, from the very beginning, there was this idea: federalism is to experiment. It's not a 20th century or a 21st century idea. It was already an 18th century idea. The states are supposed to be laboratories of experimentation. But the dogmatic and rigid form of American federalism actually conspires against the achievement of this experimentalist potential of the federal system, because it establishes a very rigid allocation of powers among the three levels of the federation. And for federalism to be experimentalist, one of the first things it has to become is cooperative. That is, the three levels of the federation have to cooperate vertically, And then the states and the municipalities have to be able to cooperate among themselves in the development of alternatives. That's how federalism becomes experimentalist. And so we have to be reinvented, reshaped. But reshaping it or reinventing it would be another example of how the Americans would have to lift this exemption against experimentalism that they accord to their institutions. Now we come to the third dimension, which is in a sense the most important, which is the dimension of consciousness. So we began the course with a discussion of what we call the American prophecy, the message of the American prophets. And interpreted in one way, the message is the message of the divinity of the ordinary man and woman, the possibility of ascending and increasing his or her share in the divine attributes, not of omniscience and omnipotence, but of transcendence. And this has taken now a form in the internal religious conflicts of the American people. So in the United States, as in many of these societies in the North Atlantic world, there is a faction of secularists and secular progressives who believe in enlightenment and emancipation in a purely secular vocabulary. And then there are Christians, Jews, and Muslims. But there's a third element in the United States, in the religious life of the American people, and it's this third element that is distinctive. The third element is what Harold Bloom called the Gnostic religion of the Americans. And it's most fully expressed in their religious inventions, like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventism, Christian Science. This is the idea that there is a direct relation of the individual to God. And that the individual is, as it were, an emanation of the uncreated divine spark. And that this is the basis of faith. This is the most important thing in the world. And of course, this idea has an intimate relation to that message of the American prophet. So one of the connections doctrinally is Emerson, one of the American prophets. And there's this conversation between the two traditional elements and this distinctive, highly original, and immensely potent element in the religious life of the American people. Their most original contribution to the religious experience of humanity. The internal conversation in American civilization is constrained by, among other things, the taboo which the liberal legal culture has imposed on the religious criticism of religion. So it is considered unacceptable in the United States to attack a religion from the standpoint of another religion. But this is absurd. It's absurd from the standpoint of religion, and it's absurd from the standpoint of political life. This taboo has to be lifted. It has to be possible to speak in the public realm from a religious voice, and there has to be religious conflict in the life of the people. And a religion should be susceptible to criticism from the standpoint of another religion. So it's as if the inner conversation were suppressed. It has to be liberated. Now here's another aspect of the consciousness. So against this naturalized institutional background of the economic order, there's the idea of the little Napoleon who crowns himself, self-construction. But self-construction can't take place that way, really. It can't evolve. It can't develop. It's static unless it can be combined with forms of collective action and solidarity on one side, and with institutional experiments in the transformation of the institutional arrangements on the other side. So there's this immensely potent belief, but in some way it's blocked. And there's this double taint that we discussed. The disturbed recognition of the relation between self-construction and solidarity, and the temptation of the institutional idolatry, the reification of the institutions. And then what happens? How can the individuals connect? They're in the situation of the porcupines that Schopenhauer describes in The World as Will and Representation. The porcupines are out in the cold. And so they try and come together to warm one another. And then they stick one another with their spines. And then they move further apart so they won't stick. And then they become cold. And so they go back and forth impatiently and restlessly until they settle into an uncomfortable middle distance from one another. And that's the distance of what results in this situation. That's the coldness that I described before when I was talking about the United States and Brazil. And what happens in that coldness? Melancholy and loneliness. Because the available devices of voluntary association are insufficient to deal with the predicament of the porcupines. And so then in this situation with their belief in the uncreated divine spark, they are restless and they are looking for the new, for liberation. And now I just want to read you a few passages from a famous chapter in Tocqueville. This is not the part that I don't agree with about the obsession of Americans with equality. Tocqueville, I think, didn't understand a central aspect of the American experience. He was focused on equality. The reason is that he associated freedom with the freedom that he knew and prized in his country, France, of the Ancien regime. He saw equality coming from the United States, and he wanted to know what would happen to freedom, which he revered. But the Americans were just as interested in freedom as he was, and they had a different conception of it against this naturalized institutional background in this middle distance. So here's what he says in this chapter. In America, I saw the freest and most enlightened men placed in the happiest circumstances that the world afford. But it seemed to me as if a cloud habitually hung upon their brow, and I thought them serious and almost sad in their pleasures. In the United States, a man builds a house in which to spend his old age, and he sells it before the roof is on. Death at last overtakes him, but it is before he is weary of his bootless chase, of that complete felicity which forever eludes him. In democratic times, enjoyments are more intense than in the ages of aristocracy, and the number of those who partake in them is vastly larger. But on the other hand, it must be admitted that man's hopes and desires are oftener blasted, and the soul is more stricken and perturbed, and care itself more keen. So in this circumstance, there is the religion of the new, living for the future. But of course, none of us ever has the future. All we ever have for life is life right now in the present. So somehow living for the future has to be converted into a way of living in the present as a being not fully determined by the present circumstances of his existence. And to do that, the religious of the new has to be somehow connected with the other person. So the question can't be simply, what is the new? But where are the others?
Profound, brother. Profound. Very much so. You know, it's fascinating to me that when you actually look at the history of profound reflections and ruminations on American civilization, they often come from people who are not Americans. Alexis de Tocqueville from France, Harriet Martineau from England, Sakhban Berkovich, taught here at this grand institution for 25 years, from Canada. There's something about trying to get at the rich depth and scope of what it is to be American, past, present, and maybe even future, if we have a grand future, actually, that those outside are able to discern. It's quite fascinating. That F.O. Matheson, Francis Otto Matheson, who taught here at Harvard for 42 years, he committed suicide, jumped off the top of the hotel in Boston, wrestling with his gay identity, but he was the greatest literary and cultural critic. He wrote a classic in 1941 called The American Renaissance. It had to do with those years between 1850 and 1855 when you got Emerson, Thoreau, you got Emily Dickinson, Hawthorne, all at the same time. There's never been that kind of American Renaissance with the exception of the blues musicians in Delta, Mississippi, all emerging at the same time, that genius bouncing up against each other. And Matheson used to begin his lectures here at Harvard and say, is America distinctive among nations to move from innocence to corruption without a mediating stage of maturity? Innocence. James Baldwin said, innocence itself is the crime. To live in denial, the denial of empire, the denial of genocide, the denial of slavery, the denial of class subordination, the denial of forms of xenophobia, the denial of patriarchy, just this land of freedom. Now, of course, there's grand aspects and facets of freedom, but this sense of denial is the benchmark of childishness, of an adolescent mentality, of a Disneyland sensibility, of a Peter Pan sentiment. Never grow up, never grow up, never grow up. So you grow powerful, you grow rich, you grow wealthy, but you never grow up. That's the United States at its worst. Now, we've got at our best. The brother who was shot 51 years ago grew up. That's what Dorothy Day meant when she wrote his eulogy April 5th, 1968, when she said, Martin Luther King Jr. learned how to die daily. And there is no life without death. There's no growing up without death. There's no maturation without going through the cross, which is to say, not a Christian symbol in this context, but suffering, pain, hurt, wrestling with the forms of death, dogma, domination. That's the benchmark of wrestling with what it means to be human. And one of the dangers these days is now we got an empire that's out of control, very much run by adolescents. And adolescents are in denial of catastrophe, ecological catastrophe, or nuclear catastrophe, or economic catastrophe, or political catastrophe. But I want to begin with this reflection on psychic catastrophe. Alexis de Tocqueville's got it right. Why Americans are so restless in the midst of prosperity. Now, he's talking about the vanilla side of town now. Let's be honest. The happiest of conditions. No, you got enslaved folk at that time. You got women wrestling with domestic households under patriarchy. So it's the vanilla male side of town. But he still captures something. He's capturing that profound sense of what Brother Roberto calls American melancholia, American sadness. There's a wonderful series of lectures given at Harvard by one of the greatest of all American playwrights named Thornton Wilder. If you get a chance to read it, they got tons of copies in Widener and all the other zillions of libraries here at our beloved Harvard. It's called The American Loneliness. And he says, what is it about these Americans that find themselves wrestling with obsession with pecuniary gain, obsession with material prosperity, survival of the strongest, the smartest, the slickest, the richest, and yet find themselves so profoundly isolated? Harvard's own David Reisman wrote a classic in the early 50s called The Lonely Crowd. What it means to be in the crowd but still wrestling with melancholia, sadness. Just think of Tennessee Williams as Blanche DuBois in Streetcar Named Desire. What did she suffer from? Tennessee understood it well. It wasn't just loneliness and sadness and melancholia. It was the undercultivated capacity to love, the undercultivated capacity for intimacy, the undercultivated capacity for risk and vulnerability. And with no love, no intimacy, no risk, no vulnerability, all the smartness and strongness and richness and slickness in the world will still leave you lonely and melancholic. What is Arthur Miller's Willie Noman in The Streetcar Named Desire? What is Eugene O'Neill's Hickey in The Iceman Cometh? What is Walter in Raisin in the Sun but lonely until mama tells him, 5 generations have gone into you. You better teach Travis something. You better be connected with your past and sense of community, or you'll find yourself just as melancholic and sadness as so many other Americans. That is, in fact, that black side of town, wrestling with forms of loneliness, but more than likely having some easier access to cultivated capacity for vulnerability, risk, love at its deepest level. So this is a spiritual, psychic, existential crisis that we're talking about. And it's rarely highlighted, especially in the academy. And it's so ghettoized and specialized. Well, let the divinity school deal with those kinds of issues. I've got things I got to do. Kennedy School's trying to deal with the technical and managerial challenge. The engineering's trying to get their numbers together. And quantification and quantitative analysis together. The business school, we know what they're doing. The law school, on their way to Wall Street. Not all of them, but a large number. I'll deal with my psychic stuff in the evening, after I put in my long hours to make my cash. Who am I missing out on? Med school. We can go on and on. Harvard College, our blessed undergrads. Caught, tortured, tormented, joyful, glad to be here. All at the same time. But being socialized into this America in 21st century version. What you gonna do about the loneliness and melancholia and sadness, the atomistic individualism that goes hand in hand with the ideological unconscious of American civilization, which is the sanctity of private property and the virtue of capitalist accumulation. Those are the non-negotiables in a certain sense of America. That's one of the reasons why it's hard for the left to ever gain a foothold. And it's one of the reasons why when slavery was abolished, that so many of the slave holders were compensated, and yet those who were slaves and who are descendants of slaves can't even get a dialogue of reparations going. Because black folk were the slaves, and if you talk about the sanctity of private property, when you take somebody's property, they must be compensated. just like those slaveholders in Washington, D.C. When they let the slaves free, it was the slaveholders who were compensated because it was their property. That's part of the ideological unconscious of American civilization, tied so deeply to this private property and capitalist modes of accumulation and production and distribution and consumption. What are we saying here? I'm going to open this up because we got good time for dialogue. On the ideological front, American civilization is constrained in a fundamental way by forms of rugged, rapacious individualism that easily becomes what Christopher Lasch argued in 1979, the culture of narcissism. Is tied to a sense of American superiority, which means America can never engage in a wholesale critique of its imperial policies. Because there's a broad consensus that you do not interrogate, just like you don't interrogate the cult of the Constitution. You don't interrogate foreign policy that might be tied to corporate interests, geopolitical interests that would call into question the democratic sensibilities and concern about everyday people in other nations. Because if you're going to be Democrats like Muriel Rukeyser or Walt Whitman or August Wilson, it's not just the dignity of everyday people in the United States, it's the dignity of everyday people in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, all around the world. Hard to make that move. That's a sign of not growing up. And of course, in the end, if you don't grow up, what happens? Malcolm X gave his lecture right here in this law school in 1964, 4 years before Brother Martin was killed. He said, the chicken's gonna come home to roost. Sooner or later, what you are repressing will return. And it will call into question the very conditions for the possibility of your social project. Politically, what are we talking about in terms of distinctiveness of the United States? One is the ways in which you channel the voices, demands, requests of citizens through a two-party system. And that two-party system was tied to something that does make America a grand outlier among modern nations, which is what? The free gift of suffrage. It's hard to think of any other modern nation, medium size, whose working class was able to gain the right to vote without organizing as a labor party, as a working class party that was fighting for the right to vote. And under Jacksonian America, working people were given the gift of suffrage. So their class consciousness was weakened, almost thoroughly dissolved. And when it emerged, it was craft consciousness. The AFL in its first manifestation over against non-craft. And we have to wait for the CIO among industrial workers vis-a-vis the craft workers. So you already have profound class divisions because there's no coming together of working people to gain the right to vote as working people. Then you've got workers on the plantation, black folk, black men and women. Because of course white women were not allowed to work in the fields even when American slavery was black and white. So there was still a patriarchal difference when it came to black sisters and white sisters, you see. But there were workers too. And it never occurred to workers in the North that those enslaved black brothers and sisters were also part of a working class. So a deep white supremacist divide among class, issues of class in the United States that makes it hard to even talk about class, let alone have a class analysis. And yet the irony is what? The obsession with economic growth, the expansion of the pie for people to gain access to it, the upward social mobility which becomes the very basis of the talk about the American dream is predicated on the coordination of corporations, banks, and the nation state to facilitate that economic growth. So there's a ruling class who comes together with its various aspects and elements. Financial, corporate, and nation state. And that's what Matheson meant by corruption. Because if somebody told the real truth about the multifaceted history of American corruption in high places, the wickedness in high places among banks, corporate elites, and nation states. Now, one of the reasons why it's hard to tell because it's been legalized. So it's not illegal sometimes. Oftentimes, it's legalized. We make deals. Our priorities have to do with our profits at the top. So what that 22% of the children live in poverty? So what that 42% of working class wrestling wage stagnation? So what that the schools are decrepit? So what that the housing is indecent? So what that we don't have access to health care? We've got economic growth. The economy's doing well. What's the GNP growth? Oh, since when has that become the benchmark? For those who are tied especially to the best of American judgments having to do with the quality of life of American citizens, from the reservations to the barrio, to the hoods, to the prisons, across the board, all the way to the gated communities, all of American citizens. And so you can see there's a real sense in which, given all the vitality, all the vibrancy, all the magnificent energy, cultural, psychic, musical, even intellectual at times, that we're still caught in an iron cage. And so we often feel helpless, powerless, relatively impotent as the big banks, big military, elites often tied to those big banks and facilitating the big military. That's the 56 cents for every dollar of the national budget that goes to the military-industrial complex. They continue to expand. And yet the decline and the decay among more and more of our fellow citizens sets in, and we turn on each other. We turn on each other. Unbelievable rage, fury, escalating greed, hatred, and most importantly, fear. Fear being manipulated often by those who are supposedly governing, supposedly ruling, but not even understanding they're undermining the very conditions for their own existence further on down the road, because no such social experiment, no empire, no democratic or project can sustain itself under such circumstances. You see? And so there's a sense in which the denial of even acknowledging what's awaiting us becomes understandable if you feel as if it's hard to take seriously the kind of thing Brother Roberto has been talking about. What are the democratic alternatives and what stands in the way of their realization, actualization, them actually being instantiated on the ground? Now, this is not in any way a counsel of pessimism. Not at all. It's a counsel of action. Action, intellectual action, cultural action, political action, pedagogical action. This class itself is an instance of pedagogical action. You all could tell from the first week we came out swinging. And we've been swinging every week. And by swinging, I'm not just talking about physical swinging. We swinging like Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald and Muhammad Ali. Those are all forms of warriorship, intellectual, moral warriorship. Because what we're talking about is America on a battlefield. And America views itself as the eternal victor, because it's often won. That's why it hardly got over Vietnam, where it lost. And that's why we learn so much from our Southern artists like Faulkner, Udura Welty, and the blues artists, where the South actually lost the war, even though their white supremacy won the peace. 1,174 Confederate monuments still dotting the American landscape, 174 of them eliminated in the last 2 years. Well, you're making some symbolic progress. You got a long way to go in terms of acknowledging the South knows their white supremacy won the peace. even though they're still upset that they lost the Civil War. You see? So that's part of the challenge, and we're going to open it up. We went much longer than we had planned, but this American exceptionalism brings out all kind of fire. This brother here, and then the brother here. Go right in. That's a fascinating formulation. You want to jump in
Cornel,
on
my
that?
suggestion is we hear a wide
Maybe
range
two or
of
three?
voices.
Okay, but we'll have to write them down and come back.
Well, we can,
Absolutely. And if we forget your point, you remind us. Where's that second hand? There you go.
louder.
Louder, though, brother.
What he's touching on in relationship, he's talking about diplomatic history, but the whole critique about the U.S. empire as a field of study comes up in the 1970s. I can't remember exactly as a field of study when you start getting diplomatic historians who actually focus on the United States statecraft. But also when he was talking about the infrastructure, this making a statement about the United States, well, the United States government in relationship to corporations or relationship to universities. Wright Mills of Power, the Power and Elite wrote, I think in 1956. I'd like to hear your perspective on what you thought about the document. Okay, nation, how he thinks about Harvard University, the military, and IBM are the only two powers that basically fund society, and the human being is just at its mercy. When it all works.
Hope you all heard a lot of that in the back, though.
Yeah, important to speak high.
What about
Here.
some sisters here?
Here.
Oh, yes, go right ahead.
It's not really a question, but more of a statement. How you touched upon the Confederate monument at the end. Historic preservation, I think, in the U.S. has been used to perpetuate this idea of exceptionalism. Because of its very short history, Americans actually obsessed with the imagery of the founding fathers, and there is records of American historic preservation actually removing what's historical and in its place erecting something new and calling it historic. And historic preservation has been used to sort of give body to the history of the U.S. And Confederate monuments is a really great example of constructing history, but it's very new. And I just think that it's very interesting to think about historical preservation and also policies that, create demarcations of, oh, this is historical, so you can't touch it. You can't build something around it or so that it becomes sacred. Remember.
And the fact that so many of these monuments are built in the 19-teens and 20s, so the historical preservation goes hand in hand with the ideological rationalization of making sure these black people remain subordinate. So it's an intervention in the present as a form of historical memory and as a form of historical preservation, you see. So that the Civil War is understood as a minor family feud between white brothers and sisters rather than a major civil war, 750,000 dead over whether these black people are going to be held in slavery in perpetuity.
One of the very first Civil War monuments is actually similar to European war memorials in that they portrayed sentiment of loss and mourning,
And the descendants, because memorials are about the present as much as the past. You know, see what I mean? It's the people building the monuments. And the fear that these black folk might once again emerge with power and so forth. That's what 51 years was about. All of a sudden now, these black folk are at the center of the historical stage, and lo and behold, Harvard decides, ooh, we only let 9 Negroes in 2 years ago. Now we're going to let 90 in. See, that's the only reason why I'm sitting here right now. If the black brothers and sisters hadn't hit the street, I would have gone to Sacramento City College and be doing my thing on the West Coast. It's true. It was that rebellion that opened the door for the ruling elites in places like Harvard, Yale, and others because of the streets being occupied and the challenge to the status quo. You can't reproduce the status quo in the midst of chaos. They were not successful rebellions, but you can't reproduce it. So you have to get some concessions. And you begin to open up. Civil rights bill didn't do it. Voting rights bill didn't do it. It was those rebellions that did it, and that's the fear. One of the fundamental fears of American civilization is that, lo and behold, these poor people and working people, in a united way come together, or you get these rebellions that are chaotic without being organized, but still bring pressure and power to bear. The ultimate fear, of course, is a multiracial majority coming together in the name of justice, which was what Martin was about, which is in part what the bullet was about, you see, to make sure that never happens from so many of the conservative and middling and moderate elites. Now, you do have progressive elites who are open to this. We don't want to view elites as monolithic. You had some progressive elites who have been calling for this for a long time. Then it happens, and they make them now center stage. You've been talking about it for 15 years, Mr. McGillicuddy. Now is your moment. Progressive white brother, I told you, based on morality and integrity, you're going to have to deal with this issue. You've been living in denial. Now the reality hits. Now he or she center stage. But we had some other questions, then we're going to get back to your questions. Yes, go right ahead.
So I'd like to offer one comment and question. I'll keep it quick.
No, you take your time. Everybody taking their time. You take your time.
It touches on you guys' notion of consciousness. I see this issue as especially important in the sense that Harvard is in many ways a microcosm for the United States. It sees itself as an exception, the gold standard, an extreme on the spectrum, and a place where material culture prevails. And surely enough, loneliness and melancholy as well. And we can tie that in, I suppose this is what Durkheim did in Suicide, this is what Marx did, this is what the Frankfurt School did, to values that are perpetuated by capitalism, by unfettered capitalism, I should say, and neoliberalism. That being the case, and this is something that you both touch upon in your work, if this feeling of loneliness and melancholy exists as a result of these unfettered systems, what is your programmatic vision to tap into as fuel for fighting the alienating effects of these systems, for fighting the alienating neoliberal order? Given that most individuals go through their entire lives suppressing this feeling of alienation, how do we liberate the feeling from this confinement, or shouldn't this find unimportant? My second question.
That's your first question? Ooh, we got a whole lot going on. Your second was like your first one?
It's that in Brazil, based on my experience, there seems to be a difference. There seems to be a stronger communal culture that leads almost all of my Brazilian friends that visit the United States to remark, "O americano é muito frio." The American is very cold. And Brazil, after the coup of João Goulart, and the exception of perhaps the Lula presidency, has also been dominated by a neoliberal order. Why do we see that communal culture exist in Brazil?
Maybe we ought to stop and reflect a little bit. You want to hit that first or second? You want to keep it going? Yes, go right ahead.
So, earlier Professor Unger mentioned that it's difficult in America to conceive of critiquing a religion from the perspective of another religion. But one of my classmates commented on how so many things in American culture are considered sacred. And we have an almost faith-like devotion to our institutions, particularly our Constitution.
Yeah.
How do you separate sort of a secular, more like civic worship critique of religion and religion in American society from interreligious critiques? If you do at all, or do you see them as the same thing and have a hard time critiquing from a secular religious perspective into like a more traditional religion?
But just so I understand, are you taking the position that there shouldn't be interreligious critique? What do you
No,
say?
I'm just commenting on the idea that if you're saying that it's difficult to envision interreligious critique here in America, which is, I may have misunderstood your point.
No, what I said is that there's a taboo against it,
So,
and that this taboo should be defined.
so if that's the case, do you include sort of the American secular devotion to our institutions and our idea of neutrality and our idea of sort of like our institution as a secular one where religion has sort of cabin role as a religious dogma that we need to include in that sort of religious discussion, or we need to include in that definition of the taboo? Or is that something separate and
Well,
you're
I
viewing that as a
directly
space
attack
from which
that.
these
So,
critiques arise?
yeah, I think that's where you would begin. You would begin to attack the institutional idolatry, even on its secular home ground. But then you would continue, and you would lift this taboo against the religious criticism of religion. So I'm against all of these things. They impoverish the national conversation about its future. You can't talk about this, you can't talk about that. Why? So the background to this is this idea that the sublime is privatized. So what is most important is confined to the private realm, to the inner conscience. The public world is about marginal equities and efficiencies, and the important stuff is locked inside of us. That's incompatible with a transformative politics.
Question?
I want to go back to this idea about the communal culture in Brazil, and I'm at the Ed School, and we talk a lot about societal transformation through sort of the positive social identity development with youth, but also critical consciousness and critical action. And this draws a lot on Freire's concept of praxis, particularly of the pedagogy of the oppressed. And I'm wondering, thinking about the differences in sort of the social structures in Brazil and the United States, if this is a fruitful path, or if we need to re-examine our approach to praxis or critical consciousness in light of American ideologies around individualism and exceptionalism.
We're getting a lot of questions.
So
up
should
there.
I? About Brazil,
Yeah,
too.
yeah, about Brazil too. Absolutely, absolutely.
Excuse me?
I have one more about Brazil.
Okay, so why don't you give yours, and then maybe I'll
And
say
then you can
something.
connect, and then I'll say something about the empire, and yeah.
Curious about the connection to like American exceptionalism and race consciousness. It seems like America had this both radical affirmation of liberty, but the existence of slavery, and the kind of the way they resolve that contradiction is through this like racial narrative of inferiority. And I'm curious about, because Brazil didn't have as much of that, maybe that kind of institutional exceptionalism or radical affirmation of liberty, if they have a different type of, it doesn't seem like they have the same type of racial narrative that prohibits them from forming maybe the multiracial coalitions. And I'm curious about like comparing those two in a case study around the connection of this exceptionalism and race consciousness.
So let me say a few things.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Will not respond to everything that has been raised in this context. So let me just make some factual remarks about Brazil so we can share this understanding of the problem. So the most important social development in Brazil in the last several decades has been the rise alongside the traditional middle class of a new middle class, of an entrepreneurial, mixed race, petty bourgeoisie, comes from below. So the traditional middle class was focused on the liberal professions, public employment, and European culture. And now we have another group that comes from below that is devoted to a culture, a consciousness of self-help and initiative. So in some respects, they're like Americans. And half of them, about half of them, are evangelical Protestants. And behind this vanguard is the mass of Brazilians who remain poor, but have their eyes fixed on this vanguard. So this is the most revolutionary element in the society. Now, several things to say. So first, the tendency of the left in modern history has been to demonize the petty bourgeoisie, this entrepreneurial so-called lower middle class. So the left in Europe in the 20th century elected the petty bourgeoisie as its enemy. It then became the core social basis of the Nazi, fascist, right-wing movements. This was a disaster. And it would be a disaster throughout the world, because there are more petty bourgeois in the world than there are industrial proletarians. And subjectively, the petty bourgeois horizon, the aspiration to modest prosperity and independence, is dominant in the world. So we have to go meet this form of consciousness and experience, and on its own terms, and attempt to translate it, to convert it to a more magnanimous set of options. It shouldn't, for example, be narrowly devoted by default to the unique device of isolated, archaic family business. That should be simply part of a menu of options. Now, this problem has to be seen now in the context of a second issue, which is the tragedy of these societies. It's implicit in this discussion of the United States and of Brazil. What is the most important attribute of those two countries? It's their vitality. It's a seething vitality. It's like a cauldron in which there are these millions of people trying to do things on their own and to save themselves and to lift themselves up. And what's the tragedy? The tragedy is that the vast preponderance of this human intensity is wasted for lack of instruments and opportunities, so that people can't have a bigger life. And there's no way to address that problem without structural and institutional innovation. Example, our discussion about the knowledge economy. There's a new vanguard of production in the world, it's this knowledge economy. Instead of being deepened and disseminated, it remains confined, quarantined, and denied to the vast majority of workers and firms. So the result is, on one side, economic stagnation, on the other side, the aggravation of inequality. So to come meet this aspiration for modest prosperity and independence, for self-help, for initiative, for self-construction, we have to innovate in the political and economic institutions. That's the structural imperative. So that's the second thing to say. Now then comes the third thing to say, which is the religious element and the religious conflict. I said in Brazil, half of them are evangelical Protestants. In the United States, the most unique element is this Gnostic religion, the third element, as I described it, of the ascent of ordinary humanity to participation in the divine life. It's an experience in sharing in the attributes of the divine. Now, what we see in Brazil is what we've seen in some aspects of American religious history, that this idea is diverted or narrowed into a form of materialist individualism. And so there's, for example, a theology of prosperity. And so let's accumulate. And somehow accumulation will be related to sanctification. And now, so, this is a surrogate for the real thing. So Robinson Crusoe accumulates stuff on his island. Why does he accumulate stuff? Because he doesn't have people. And because the accumulation of property is a substitute for the real thing, which is interdependence. So Rousseau says in the Emile, they couldn't become men, so they decided to become rich. And it's the same thing. So this is a perversion. It's a political economic perversion,
That's
and
right.
it's a spiritual.
Absolutely.
And it's a spiritual perversion. So the evangelical impulse in this form, and here's then the third theme implicit in these conversations, going back to the issue of coldness and warmth. So the political theology of evangelical Protestantism in Brazil could be understood as a kind of liberalism for the masses. There's this corrupted world, tainted by the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. Let's secede from it into these smaller worlds that we control, the converted, the saving remnant, and that will be characterized by these relations of autonomy, of promise-keeping, of reliability. We won't depend on anyone. We'll make ourselves, and we'll free ourselves from the chains of the wider society, but at a huge price, because then there's the price of not confronting the structures and changing them through collective action. So it's a political economic mistake, but it's also a spiritual misdirection, and it has to be changed. So these themes have to be connected in Brazil and in the United States. It's as if these two sets of national experiences are ringing the changes on one another. They're variations on the same themes. And this is what's wonderful about this kind of a discovery. And it involves, on one side, political and economic innovation in the structures and the institutions, but on the other side, it's a spiritual contest. It's a contest about who we are and what we can become. And when politics is serious, it must have this religious aspect, which we can't suppress, imposing this unacceptable taboo on the spiritual dimension in politics and on the religious criticism of religion. Do you want to add something to that?
No, I want to try to make a connection, though, between this rich discussion about Brazil and the American empire and the role of Harvard University as a site of ruling class formation that helped facilitate and justify and rationalize the American empire. Well, it's been doing that for a long time, brother, but it highlighted at that particular moment. But it started a long time ago. But yes, we can zero in on World War II. But one thing to keep in mind is, first I just want to make a point about melancholia, sadness, despair, despondency, disappointment, and disease. That all of these are features of the human condition no matter what social system you have. And I can't imagine a social system that can provide a solution to melancholia, sadness, despair, despondency, disease, and disappointment. So any grand democratic project is still a proximate solution to these insoluble problems. Because that's what it is to be human. To be a primate on the way to extinction generates anxiety. And every social system imaginable or enacted cannot deal with those particular elements. So there's forms of sadness, there's forms of melancholy that are connected with capitalist societies and so forth and so on. But still, all the way down at the human level, where we started this class, what does it mean to be human? That I just want to make that point. So I'm against sadness and melancholy and all, but I just want to say that in the end, that he or she who's never despaired has never lived. He or she who's never wrestled with sadness and melancholy has really never been human. You've been trying to be something else. At your mama's funeral, if you're not sad and so, something's going on. Get off the crack pipe. You have to deal with reality. The body's in the coffin. She's gone. Now, when we talk about Brazil and the United States, Brazil has never had a transcontinental empire. So it's one of those social experiments that's never really had to come to terms with the challenges of what it is to be an imperial entity. And that I think Brazil itself is an empire, internally, vis-a-vis indigenous peoples. But it's not transcontinental. That's a very different kind of experience in the modern world. Very different kind of experience. Now, when you are the major empire, the most powerful and influential empire, and you deny it, that's real psychic dysfunctionality that generates forms of willful blindness and learned ignorance. If you can have a whole curriculum at Harvard and you look for the courses on the American empire, and you find some little isolated course taught over here and over here, you say, this place is in denial. If somebody came from Mars and just looked around and saw almost 5,000 U.S. military units and 587 units in foreign countries and 128 countries with special operations of U.S. Army, and you come to the curriculum and say, well, we're having difficulty trying to keep alive our domestic project, blah, blah, blah. You say, these folk are not serious about Veritas. They're not really serious about trying to understand who they really are. World War II, 1890s, internal colonial expansion called Manifest Destiny and so forth. So that the juxtaposition between Brazil and the United States becomes very, very important. Then you got one-drop rules. If Brazil had the one-drop rule, there would have been revolution a long time ago. Because over what, 80-some% of Brazilians have black blood? I mean, Brother Roberto would be a black man.
Absolutely.
In Chicago. Because he got all kind of drops.
And
All kind of black drops.
a Native American also.
You'd be indigenous, brother, too.
Yeah.
See, so that the very construction of the classification of race and black is very different in the United States vis-a-vis Brazil. Same is true, different in Jamaica, different Barbados, and so forth and so on. So then you got the question of the way in which white supremacy has been articulated within these various contexts with both societies based on slavery, but no Jim Crow in Brazil. You see, the crucial thing about the history of the United States is not slavery, it's Jim Crow. When you go from slave to citizen in one pop, that's unprecedented. That's the best of America. That you can transform 4 million slaves into citizenship like that. But then 12 years, they are under conditions of neo-slavery for another 100 years. That's unprecedented. You don't get that in Jamaica, you don't have it in Barbados, you don't have it in Brazil, you don't have it in other slave-based societies in the Western Hemisphere, you see. So that you end up with a very different talk about the American spirit and so forth and so on. And last but not least, when it comes to the vitality and vibrancy, that's the very source of the hope. Because it's been that moral vitality, that cultural vibrancy that has generated voices, movements, counter structures, countervailing institutions. And Harvard is one of the sites where this contestation takes place. When I talk about F.O. Matheson, he's one of the towering figures and truth tellers, white Protestant brother, Christian socialist, gay brothers at a time in which homophobia was thoroughly hegemonic, a moment in which anti-Jewish quotas were thoroughly hegemonic, he bringing critique to bear as a white Protestant based on his sense of moral integrity. That's prophetic voice. He's a human being who's choosing to make these kind of choices against the grain of his day. And in many ways, it was too much. That's where the suicide came in. It's too much, because it's a hell of a lot to bear if you're going to cut so radically against the grain in any moment in which you find yourself, and you still have to deal with the everyday burdens of being human, with family, and job, and career, and so forth, and so on. Other questions?
Just one thing.
Yes.
I feel that in my answer to the Brazilian questions, I didn't do justice to the issue of coldness and warmth. And so let me just say one word about that. So one of the questions that emerges from our conversation here is, how can we be both free and warm? And so that our emancipation not result in this coldness, the circumstance of the porcupines. And in the answers that we're struggling for, it seems to me, there are two main dimensions. So One dimension is the dimension of connection.
Yeah.
That is, we can't solve the problem as isolated individuals. It's through collective action and through these institutional arrangements that sustain and develop the connections in every part of social life. And we can't understand economic accumulation as if it were a way of substituting for the missing connections. They don't. It can't substitute for the missing connection. So that's one dimension and half of the answer to the question. But it's not the whole answer, because there's this other dimension which has to do with bigness and how we can become big together. So one of the fundamental mistakes, one of the most common mistakes that people make in their lives, is they devote their lives to aims that are too small. And devoting your life to an aim that's bigger means trying to do something that breaks the rigidified form of the self, that requires you to break out of your mummy, the stylized form of the self that is the character, that involves you in circumstances in which you're not in control. So you have to pay the price of a heightened vulnerability. That's the shadow of this ascent to bigness. And that's part of this vibrancy, of this vitality. That's what vitality is. The attributes of vitality are surfeit, surprise, spontaneity. And as a moral project for the individual, and as a political project for the society. It's incompatible with this notion that the sublime, the most important, will be privatized. And politics will just be about the cold marginal stuff of the equities and the efficiencies. That's the fundamental answer, and in which that's what the American people and the Brazilian people would desire, to be free without being cold. And the answer to this question is some complicated combination of political, economic, and spiritual projects.
Of maturity.
For the individual and for the society.
See, I would want to object to the language of bigness in the U.S. context, because we in America, we confuse greatness with the gigantic. So the bigger you are, you think
bigger in the sense of increasing our share in the divine attribute of transcendence.
Well, see, that's greatness. That's something else. Because greatness, and I come out of the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem, right? So greatness has to do with he or she who's willing to serve, sacrifice, give, just like the brother who was shot 51 years ago. I say Martin was great. He was a little man, physically. Doctor looked at his body in the coffin and said he must be at least 69 years old, but he was 39. Why? Because he gave so much, he left empty, but he filled so many of us up with spirit, inspiration, and so forth. So he was not in that sense, he was great in the biblical sense, or great in the psychological, spiritual sense of maturity, risk, vulnerability, capacity to love, so forth and so on. Now, it's true that, but that's what you mean by
the words. The words are all loaded and suspect. Great is also loaded and suspect.
It is, but it's less loaded than big.
No, I'm not sure.
It is.
Because it has this idea of the hierarchy.
But nobody thinks Trump is great, but he thinks he's big and he thinks he's rich. But there's certain resonances to greatness that still have a moral and spiritual tilt, even among those who may deny it. I would argue. But the important point is that
to deprivatize the sublime, to make it public,
unleash it into public spaces in the form of thought and action and so forth. Well,
our time is up.
Our time is getting up. So next week we shall continue with.
And time is our enemy. So
time is our
so
enemy.
We have a guest next week who is Francis Fukuyama, and we'll continue our discussion with him.
Wonderful, wonderful.